Our first speaker in this afternoon session is Pallavi Kache.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University, and I'm excited to share some of my doctoral work, which takes a transdisciplinary landscape ecology and urban sciences approach to studying Aedes-borne diseases. So today I'll be talking through a conceptual tool that I've been developing alongside collaborators to examine Aedes-borne diseases through this urban sciences lens, and then talk through a statistical typology analysis to assess dengue risk. And so when we look at photos of how urbanization is occurring around the world today, we see these really striking images of high-density housing next to primary forest or high-rise apartments in the middle of agrarian rural landscapes. And the data behind these photos is equally as striking. So in fewer than 100 years, the global urban population will have grown from 1 billion to an estimated 6 billion people. And the projections of urbanization show that urban land area will double in the next 30 years to 1.3 kilometers squared. And this pace of urbanization has significant downstream effects on the capacity of cities to provide essential public services, such as adequate housing, water, and sanitation services. And all of these drivers contribute to the proliferation of container breeding mosquitoes like Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, which are highly adapted to urban environments, as we heard this morning, and rest, breed, and feed in close proximity to humans. They also transmit arboviruses like dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. And because these mosquitoes are lazy flyers, as we heard this morning, they have a limited flight range, and we end up with a system where the ecological drivers of Aedes mosquitoes and Aedes-borne disease transmission are highly tied to the local physical infrastructure and socioeconomic conditions in a city. And so in the coming decades, the compounding effects of climate change and this rapid urbanization are expected to expand the environmental suitability for dengue occurrence across parts of the southern United States, South America, Africa, and Australia, really demonstrating the global scale of the association between urbanization and dengue, and just the scale of this emerging issue. And so given these shifts into such a highly urbanized world, which is nested in the current climate crisis, the World Health Organization and UN Habitat recently responded by signing a memorandum of understanding to create a framework for cooperation to improve urban health. And so this MOU prioritizes a number of issues, including the management of epidemic risk of vector-borne diseases and integrated vector management. In order for this type of collaboration to be successful at the level of an international organization, scientific communities must also have the capacity and the language and understanding to be able to bridge these disciplines to understand how urban systems are affecting Aedes-borne disease transmission. And over the past few decades, the disease and vector ecology communities have amassed a vast understanding of what drives heterogeneity in Aedes-borne disease transmission within cities by many people online and in the audience today. And so these the drivers of heterogeneity include varied patterns of human mobility, like we talked about this morning, urban microclimate, human population density, and socioeconomic drivers of Aedes species. This is obviously just a short list of the hundreds of papers thousands of papers that are out there on this particular subject. And so with this immense body of work, disease ecologists have gained an understanding of the interactions between Aedes vectors, arboviruses, and human hosts within the context of urban environments. And what I noticed in kind of going through the literature is that in parallel to our field, it are disciplines that are focused primarily on the intersection between individual and societal level human interactions with the urban environment, which I refer to here as the urban sciences. And so with these fields, we have an opportunity to build on our existing understanding of Aedes-borne disease transmission by bringing the urban environment from a background context to the foreground as an active driver of a lot of the processes involved in arbovirus transmission. And I think it's a subtle but a really important distinction to make here. And a key theoretical underpinning within the urban sciences is framing cities as complex adaptive systems. And so the system is comprised of self-organizing building blocks, which I'll come back to in a few slides, with cross-scale interactions, interconnectedness across a spatial extent of a city, as well as dynamic processes, both in terms of adaptation to changing conditions, as well as memory carried by the system. And all of these properties lay the foundation for how we've conceptualized this urban systems framework for Aedes-borne diseases. And so with an interdisciplinary team, we sought to build a conceptual tool that could be a launching point for bridging theoretical and empirical work across these historically siloed disciplines. And we've been really fortunate to collaborate with urban scientists such as Drs. Karen Cito and Elizabeth Cook to develop a framework for understanding Aedes-borne diseases, which is really rooted and takes into account knowledge acquired in the urban sciences. And so we draw on two major concepts from this field. The first, as I mentioned, is cities as complex adaptive systems. And the second is relational theory, which explores how human social dynamics and the environment co-develop over time. And we combine these concepts with the more traditional landscape ecology theory known as hierarchical patch systems theory, which examines how the urban landscape is comprised of nested patches of increasing complexity. And so the following slides show some of the core ideas that we've developed using this hierarchical patch systems theory. And I'm excited to share that this work has been provisionally accepted and hoping to share it with you all soon. And so if we're saying that we start off with these tiled building blocks that are shown on the left, we start to define this tile through interacting biophysical properties like the urban environment, socioeconomic properties like the age structure or population size, institutional properties such as piped water access, as well as cultural properties. And then using a risk framework where risk is defined as a product of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, we've hypothesized that the properties of the urban system, that each tile has properties that contribute to risk that can be defined at a highly local scale. And so when we begin to aggregate the building blocks into what we call urban patches, we can see how the configuration of patches of differing composition can have varied levels of emergent risk. And risk is also differentially distributed across the city based on different rates of human movement, as we heard this morning. And so with this conceptual tool in hand, we sought out methods of operationalizing and giving meaning to these theoretical concepts through statistical and empirical analyses, as well as mechanistic models that really integrate or seek to integrate the urban system and disease dynamics. And so we use Ibagué, Colombia, as a case study. And so this city has a population of about 500,000 people and sits in the middle of the Andean mountain region. And this topographical complexity is really important as we think about introduced variation or just the variation given within an urban landscape. And so in operationalizing the patch composition, we divided the city into tiles of 100 by 100 meters as our initial building block, as I described earlier, and used remotely sensed environmental variables and census-derived socioeconomic data to characterize each tile. And so elevation, as I mentioned earlier, is a key feature in the city, and the city has an elevation gradient that goes from about 900 meters in the east to 1,450 meters in the west, which has really important implications for the temperature variability in the city. And so we use satellite data to characterize vegetation, as well as the built-up intensity that were both gathered at 30-meter resolution and then aggregated up to 100 meters. Finally, we use census data gathered at a block scale to characterize the socioeconomic features in the city. And so with the principal components analysis, we found that factors such as building density and population density had the greatest contribution to the first dimension, and then in the second, socioeconomic factors had the highest contribution. In the third, which is not shown here, elevation had the highest contribution. And then we use unsupervised hierarchical clustering algorithms to develop typologies based on the landscape and socioeconomic conditions. So I think I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to go a couple slides forward. And so when we look at the typologies in relation to dengue cases within the city, so these case data were taken from geolocated cases that are then aggregated to the tiles. And so in this example from 2019, we see multiple space-time clusters with the size of the circle indicating the spatial extent of the clusters. And so we see that initial clusters begin in mid-April in high population density typologies, and that by mid-June, these clusters have moved to have centroids in lower population density areas with much larger spatial sizes. And so this led us to the hypothesis that there is structure in how the disease spreads both spatially and temporally in a city that we may be able to explore with a metapopulation model. And so in current endeavors with a fellow grad student from Colombia, Jaime Cascante Vega, we are building metapopulation models that incorporate this variation into elevation and temperature, as well as population density. And then, as well as future statistical methods, we'll seek to incorporate emergent effects of patch composition. And so to wrap this up, I know that kind of rushed towards the end there, but we saw that rapid urbanization is likely to expand the global distribution of dengue, and there is an urgent need to integrate both theory and methods across the disciplines of public health and urban development. And so what we hope is that this urban systems framework can provide a conceptual tool to be able to bridge these two disciplines and provides an opportunity to ask questions in new ways. And this is a new conceptual tool, and so I welcome any and all ideas and any feedback on the framework that I presented. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone, as well as funding sources, and you can find me on Twitter and by email. Thank you.